So welcome everyone to this Transatlantic Currents webinar on Donald Trump's quest for a grand bargain on the Russia-Ukraine war and a reshaped American role in transatlantic defense. My name is Maria Linden, and I'm a research fellow here at the Center on U.S. Politics and Power here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And I will shortly hand the virtual mic over to the people that you've actually come to listen to today. But before I do so, I have just a couple of practicalities regarding questions from the audience. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, but as you listen to the conversation, please feel free to type in questions and comments using the chat function. I will later read them out loud and give our guest speaker an opportunity to answer some of them. Now, to introduce our wonderful speakers. Our guest will be interviewed by our non-resident fellow, Leo Michel, who is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He has had a decades-long career in U.S. government, where he served as a government distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, director for NATO policy, and director for non-nuclear arms control at the OSD and the Pentagon. He has degrees from Johns Hopkins and Princeton University. Our guest, Dr. Celeste Wallander, is the director of Penn, Washington, and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. But I will let Leo introduce her further. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Maria, and hello to everyone from Washington. As Maria mentioned, Celeste is currently the Executive Director of Penn, Washington, which is a very interesting center. It's the University of Pennsylvania's center in Washington, D.C., where she connects Penn's very dynamic academic community with current and future leaders in public policy and government affairs. And in fact, she's had a remarkable career involving teaching and innovative research on security and geopolitics at a number of leading American universities, think tanks, and foundations. It would take me too long to list them all. But she has had an impressive career in government, and until January of this year, Celeste served as under an appointment by President Biden as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And in this role, she was a top advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, on all aspects of defense and security policy related to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Under President Obama, Celeste served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and she later became the Special Assistant to the President for Russia and Eurasia on his National Security Council staff. Celeste, Russia's war on Ukraine and its increasing hybrid or gray zone threats to NATO allies are at the forefront of concerns of many in today's audience. So let's start the discussion there. Could you describe, or how would you describe, Mr. Putin's theory of victory in Ukraine? Have his goals evolved in important ways, do you think, since the full-scale invasion of February 2022, or perhaps even more recently since his Alaska meeting with Mr. Trump? Despite the costs of the war to Russia's military and economy, does Putin, in your estimation, seem ready to assume even more risks in provocative actions vis-a-vis the NATO allies?
Well, thank you, Leo, and thank you to the entire team at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs for inviting me to meet with you today and talk about these issues. I only regret I can't be in Helsinki right now, but it's great to intellectually be with this wonderful team. Putin's core goal in Europe is to prevent countries on Russia's borders, primarily countries of the former Soviet Union, but generally in a geopolitical sense, countries in Russia's border territories, from making independent sovereign choices about their foreign, economic, and national security policies. And this has been true not just since February 2022, it's been true for going on 20 years. The stakes for Putin and Putin's Russia is that Putin does not see Russia as secure or successful if countries on those borders don't have fundamentally subservient interests to Moscow. And there have been a variety of mechanisms for achieving that. One has been through creating unresolved conflicts on the territories of many of those countries, beginning with Moldova some 35 years ago, and also Georgia about in the same time period. So by maintaining unresolved conflicts, what the Kremlin has been able to do is to stall and complicate the path of those countries when they choose it to join the EU and or to join NATO. The other primary mechanism has been through political influence with the leadership. So think of the most obvious example of that is the Kremlin and Putin's relationship with Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. These are relationships of a corruption in business, in international and domestic business, political dependence in the case of Lukashenko, and relying upon a host of advantages in Russian disinformation operations and in security services support. But it was also true in Ukraine, earlier in Ukraine's periods of independence, that leaderships in Kyiv were subject to business relationships that are shady relationships that would probably get them in trouble if they were publicly known to the Ukrainian voters, but also dependence on things like energy pipelines, the natural gas pipelines running through Ukraine, which on occasion the Kremlin used to coerce positive decisions on the part of Ukrainians. I want to talk about Ukraine again in a second and bring it to the current, but I want to highlight a really clear case example of how Russia under Putin has sought to and succeeded often in maintaining this kind of influence. And that is the case of Georgia. Under the leadership of Mikhail Saakashvili, Russia lost control of Georgia's foreign policy, national security policies, and economic ties, primarily to Europe, but also to the United States. And this was as a result of free and fair elections in which the Georgian people clearly chose a path towards EU membership and NATO membership. But when Mikhail Saakashvili lost in free and fair elections in Georgia and the new leader of Georgia, Bidzina Ivanishvili, came to power, the Kremlin's opportunity for controlling Georgia by controlling the political relationship with its leadership became a real one again. And Bidzina Ivanishvili is essentially a Russian businessman of Georgian background who became the president of Georgia and is now its most influential political and economic figure, and is close to the Kremlin. His fortune depends on his relationship with the Kremlin, and his power in Georgia depends on his fortune. So the Kremlin now has leverage and influence in Georgia, and we've seen a complete reversal in Georgia's foreign and national security policy as a result. So think of what the Kremlin has achieved in Georgia and understand that as the goal in Ukraine. That was the reason for the intervention in Ukraine in 2014 in seizing Crimea and interfering in Donetsk and Luhansk to both create an unresolved conflict on the territory of Ukraine, a la Moldova and Georgia, but also to demand influence through local leaderships controlled by the Kremlin to control Ukraine's national sovereignty and foreign policy decisions, to put a brake on Ukraine's aspirations for EU membership, which it was advancing in 2013 and 2014, and NATO membership as well. It didn't work. Ukrainians are too feisty, too determined to be independent. And the efforts of the Kremlin to leverage the Minsk agreements to an interpretation that favored that kind of political influence failed because Europe and the United States were aware of the machinations, having seen it in Georgia and Moldova. So when Minsk failed, basically the Kremlin bided its time, rebuilt its military forces, and in 2022 tried again. This time, the military intention was not to simply seize territory, but was to seize Kyiv, was to seize the capital, arrest and probably eliminate the Zelensky leadership and put in place a Russian compliant Ukrainian leadership, as per the previous president, Viktor Yanukovych, who had run away in 2014 to Russia and no longer was president of Ukraine. When the Russian military forces failed to seize Kyiv, then you began to see the shift of Russian military strategy to conduct a very long-term war in order to push for a peace settlement that would enable Putin to achieve an agreement that gives Russia a veto over Ukraine's national security decision-making and sovereignty. And that's kind of what brings you up to date today. So to answer your question, no, the goals have not changed. The instruments vary and have varied over the past 20 years or so of Putin's rule of Russia, but the objective is always to find a way, either through political influence or military occupation, or forcing an agreement that acknowledges Russia having a veto over the sovereign decisions of those neighboring countries. And that veto would enable Moscow to maintain influence and prevent those countries from becoming truly democratic, truly liberal economies, truly integrated with Europe and the international system.
It's very interesting and very helpful that you put this in context, and using the example of Georgia, I think is quite instructive. But as I mentioned, I mean, it is accepted that Russia has paid quite a high price since 2022 in terms of its military, at least its land forces, and its economy. And yet, to bring this a little bit even closer up to date, you wrote, I think, just a few weeks ago that the Alaska meeting, in your words, quote, strengthened Putin, and in doing so has prolonged both the war in Ukraine and his hold on power. That's the end of that little quote. Is that still your view?
It's very much my view. And I think we have to be hard at, and I wrote that because I think that there is a lot of wishful thinking going on in many circles in less than before. We've all had a hard dose of reality, but even so, the notion that Putin would be happy with a peace settlement that even if the Ukrainians were willing to cede sovereignty over Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, even if that were possible. And it's quite difficult to imagine that Ukrainian citizens would support that. And since Ukraine is a democracy, President Zelensky is constrained in whatever kind of agreement he would eventually sign. But even if that were possible, that's not what Putin wants. Putin doesn't want to control, he doesn't want those territories to be part of Russia. I mean, he also wants that. But what he needs is a hook, a lever, an instrument of coercion and control to prevent an independent Ukraine from deciding to continue on the path of European Union membership and to continue on the path of meeting NATO standards in order to become a member of NATO. And by simply agreeing to territorial concessions, Putin gives up that leverage. That's what he learned in 2014. The initial intervention of Crimea wasn't to annex Crimea. It was to seize Crimea and create an unresolved conflict. But by annexing Crimea, Russia lost the opportunity to create a new Transnistria, as in Moldova, or Abkhazia or South Ossetia in Georgia, hence the intervention in Donetsk and Luhansk. So simply getting the territory doesn't get Putin what he wants. And that's why we need to understand he is in it for the long term, and he is willing and as I note, at this point, quite able to continue the conflict until he gets the peace settlement he wants. And one does not need to be a 40-year four-decade Russia expert as I am to be able to understand what those terms are, because he has been completely public and straightforward about his demands. And those are not just bargaining positions. Those are demands that he has held for at least 10 years in the case of Ukraine and has talked about for 2 decades. So it's time to start understanding that Putin is serious about changing the rules of the international order, changing the rules of the UN Charter, and demanding that Ukraine cede control over its own sovereign decisions. That's what's at stake, and that's what he's willing and able to keep fighting for.
Celeste, I won't ask you to predict Mr. Trump's next moves on Russia and Ukraine. That would be, I think, a very difficult task. But how would you, from your background and your analysis and your experience in policymaking, how would you assess his policies and focusing on actions, not just on some of the cryptic things he puts out on, and sometimes not so coherent things that he may put out on social media? But how would you assess his policies and his actions so far? And a related question, if I can fit this in your opinion, what are the kinds of steps that would be necessary to change Mr. Putin's calculus, since he, from the outside, appears to think that time is on his side?
So on the plus side, the Trump administration has continued to deliver the military equipment and the security assistance that was put on contract during the Biden administration. There was some question early in the Trump administration's period of power back in January whether they might cancel those contracts. And they have not canceled those contracts. And that has helped to support Ukraine in its ongoing defenses. And that is a very welcome turn of events and decision by the Trump administration. The Trump administration has also been willing to continue the practice of approving contracts by European countries to buy American-made capabilities, either for eventual delivery or to backfill European donations of capabilities. That is, contrary to some of the headlines, that is not a new practice, but it was something that the Trump administration did not have to decide to do. And its willingness to do that and to highlight it publicly was very welcome, because it sent a signal to the Kremlin that even though it's committed to a long war, Ukraine can continue to fight and defend itself, both with the continuing provision of American-provided capabilities and now European priority deliveries and longer-term contracts. All of that is very positive. All of that is, I think, something the Kremlin was waiting to see, whether there would be a quick downturn in security assistance, things like, absolutely vital deliveries of ammunition, spare parts, air defense interceptors, air-to-air missiles, the kinds of things that have kept the Ukrainians in the fight for 3.5 years. So that is extremely positive. I think it is also positive that after a rough patch, the Trump administration has now supported the right of Ukraine to defend itself. It no longer questions it. Occasionally, voices in the Trump administration question whether Ukraine is able to continue, although most recently President Trump came out and said he sees them as quite able to continue to defend themselves and even to take back territory. But I think the consistency now that you're seeing, which was a little bit fractured earlier in the year, between support, for the most part, bipartisan support in Congress, continuing strong American public support in the most recent polling, and then now the White House being clear that President Trump not only acknowledges, but supports Ukraine's right to defend itself. All of that is positive because I think the Kremlin was waiting to see whether that would all fracture. So that's been extremely important. What is more concerning is that if the goal is to help Ukraine not simply defend what it's got, but begin to put Russia at a disadvantage and perhaps even take back territory in order to lay the groundwork for an equitable and lasting peace settlement, that's not going to come at the present level of security assistance. And what we haven't seen is the Trump administration go to Congress and ask for a new authorization and appropriation of presidential drawdown authority to be able to send Ukraine materials urgently from U.S. stocks and to create new contracts for longer-term provision, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is what the Biden administration used to create those contracts for longer-term supplies. Without that kind of bump up in security assistance provision, it's really difficult. And this is not a criticism of Ukraine. They're extraordinarily creative. They are now building up their own defenses. But Russia is an enormous country with a much larger military, a lot of determination. And in order to be able to go on the offensive, Ukraine is going to need an increase, as I said, in security assistance. But the real key is, so the message is being sent correctly to the Kremlin and appropriately and constructively that United States and Europe are not going to abandon Ukraine. But Russia has found ways, Putin has found ways to continue the fight. He doesn't face domestic opposition. He doesn't face an independent media that can highlight the losses. He has a pretty professional and skilled economic and financial team, many of them Western educated, who've been able to manage the strains on the budget. And so without going after Russia's source of income in a very concerted, consistent, and strategic way, Russia has gotten very good at muddling through in budgetary, financial, and economic terms. And so that right now, I think, is the key missing piece to send a message to the Kremlin that it better reevaluate its assumption that it has all the time in the world to achieve its objectives.
Thank you. If you don't mind, and in the interest of time, because we do want to leave time for our audience to pose its questions, I'd like to turn a little bit to the future of U.S. defense and security relations with Europe. The invitation to this webinar, in fact, mentioned your July article in Foreign Affairs, where you argue essentially that American attempts to fundamentally shift responsibilities and burdens for European security away from the United States and more towards Europe could actually produce some downsides for U.S. interests. I really encourage the audience members to read the entire article that Foreign Affairs published. But could you take a few minutes to explain with perhaps some practical examples how that trend could impact and possibly harm long-term U.S. interests and perhaps those of some allies as well?
So thanks for your kind words about the article. Think in terms of sort of three areas of American advantages through the alliance. I mean, in addition to the great advantage of a common defense and working our way through the Cold War without a hot war in Europe because of the effectiveness of a unified NATO and a strong defense and deterrence capability that we don't know if in the end the Soviet Union would have been tempted or subsequently Russia is tempted to launch conventional military operations against NATO. That's the nature of deterrence. You can never be entirely sure if it worked, but it at least is consistent with the absence of great power war in Europe in the second half of the 20th century and the first couple of decades of the 21st century. But beyond that, the United States has accumulated a number of advantages as a result of its leadership of the NATO alliance. The ones I point to as highly important are access, basing, and overflight advantages, which enable the United States to contribute to that extraordinary defense of Europe, but even more. American access, basing, and overflight in Europe has enabled U.S. military operations in the Middle East. It enabled U.S. military operations in Afghanistan. It has at times been vital to evacuation and humanitarian operations. The United States is a long way from the rest of the world. The U.S. military definitely has global reach, but most aircraft do not have the capacity to fly from the American homeland to every point in the globe. And even if they did, that would be a lot of flight time. So having that access, basing, and overflight is a huge advantage in American missions of all sorts, whether that has been kinetic security missions and operations, or humanitarian support, or rescue missions, including civilian and non-combatant evacuation. I had the privilege, when I served in the Pentagon during the Biden administration, of visiting many of those bases and seeing in very tangible ways how lucky we were, for example, that in Rota, Spain, the United States is able to home port or port destroyers, which then help to defend against the Houthi attack on shipping in the Gulf of Aden and in the Red Sea. So not a NATO mission, although certainly one consistent with European interests and global interests in freedom of navigation and commercial shipping passage. So that's one example. Another example of access, basing, and overflight that I point to in the article is that American homeland defense in one dimension depends on our ability with NATO allies to actively, consistently, and effectively patrol the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap in the North Atlantic, which is the venue for America to be able, with allies, to track and monitor Russian nuclear missile submarines, which are stealthy and can evade detection, but it's not a good idea to make them that easy for them. And often the combined efforts of the allies are very successful in tracking those submarines. And those submarines are not going through the North Atlantic to attack Warsaw or other NATO countries. They're explicitly going through the North Atlantic to be able to move towards the U.S. homeland. So that's a very material interest that American citizens have in our partnership and agreements with European countries. But another one I point to is that many European countries over the decades have chosen to purchase U.S. military capabilities. There is a very robust and capable European defense industry. Much of it is in Finland. Much of it is in Sweden, now both NATO allies. NATO allies have the option to procure military capabilities from European defense producers, but often they choose American capabilities, not merely because, as Americans think, we have the best stuff. Our stuff is very expensive. It takes a long time to get there. It's often hard to maintain. But the advantage of working on common platforms with U.S. forces means that many NATO countries can count on American forces being based and operating and defending their skies, their territory, and in some cases, their maritime areas. We've already seen some decisions to not procure American air defense capabilities and instead to procure European systems since January of this year, as European allies begin to hedge against the possibility that the United States may reduce its commitment, its posture commitment, and also its political commitment to the alliance. And in the interests of quicker delivery, lower price tag, and greater integration among European systems and European self-reliance, we've seen that pivot. And finally, the last and quickly, because I know you want to move on to other questions and then to ask questions of our colleagues, is simply the political influence that the United States has had globally by being able to count on coordinating with the countries of the European Union, but also now the 32, amongst ourselves, the 32 allies of NATO, is a huge asset in often when the United States goes to the UN General Assembly to lay down a marker in support of international law, to have a unified front with Europe. Because of the close collaboration, the practices of consultation and agreeing before going in to a UN General Assembly meeting or sometimes a UN Security Council meeting has elevated the role of American global leadership and enabled it to compete in those global fora increasingly as the United States finds itself confronted by China's ability to create its own coalition of countries supporting Chinese priorities against American interests. And I believe that for the most part, that will continue because that coordination is rooted in our common values and our common interests. But I have seen instances where European countries changed their votes and conceded in the interests of unity and supporting the United States, seeing that broader interest in the protection of American global leadership. And if that starts to fray, the United States may find it much more difficult to keep that unity within the transatlantic community on the global stage.
Well, these are excellent reminders of why the alliance serves American national security interests as much as it serves those of our Canadian and European allies. Thank you so much. My last question does require a brief background, and let me summarize it this way. Over the past 8+ months, the Trump administration has taken steps to restructure and to reorient U.S. national security institutions, their tools, even their personnel. In the military sphere, for example, several top commanders, advisors, and legal officers have been dismissed or forced to resign with little or no explanation. Judging by the President and Secretary of Defense remarks last week to some 800 American generals and admirals and their top enlisted advisors, their intent appears to be to involve U.S. armed forces in domestic policing and so-called domestic counterterrorism missions. It was also said that the intention is to liberate, I'm quoting, liberate U.S. forces from what they see as the constraints of longstanding rules of engagement and internationally recognized laws of war, such as the Geneva Conventions, and in many ways, at least in my opinion, turn back the clock on the role of women and minorities in the armed forces. We've also seen credible reports of considerable tumult in the U.S. intelligence community, to include the firing of officials and analysts whose leadership or work product apparently was deemed insufficiently supportive of the political or ideological bias of top policymakers. And I'm sure you've read some of these in the newspaper. There are credible reports suggesting an unprecedented level of political vetting, and one might even say, I would say, purging of career and nonpartisan civil servants working in various national security related departments. It's not my intention to ask a provocative question, but it may sound provocative to some. How concerned should one be about the uncertainty and possible friction that such developments might introduce into the fabric of our long-standing and very close defense, military, and intelligence relationships that, from my experience at least, they really have anchored U.S. security, U.S. and European security ties for many decades now?
So let me start with the observation that you cannot make good decisions if you don't have good information. If you don't believe me, look at the failure of the Russian invasion of Kyiv in February of 2022. Russia's military is not going to come to the boss and say, it's not a good idea. We don't really have the assets. The Ukrainians may be more ready than you think. They're not just our little brothers. They actually have been trained by the American military over the last few years, and they've learned how to fight. And this is going to be tougher than you think it is. That's just not going to happen in the Russian system. You will be fired, if not worse. So you see this in authoritarian systems across the board. No one came to Stalin and said, cooperating with the Germans back in the 1930s, that's not a really good bet, because Hitler's been pretty clear that he intends to invade the Soviet Union, not just Western Europe. So again and again and again, history is filled with examples where leaders who either do not listen to experts, and among them, I include political appointees in the US system, but most fundamentally, the extraordinary professionals who've dedicated their careers to their subject matter expertise in the public service. And one of the advantages of democracy is messy. Democracy can be frustrating. I have been in meetings in the National Security Council and in the Pentagon where the leadership wanted, the political leadership had an idea about a policy, and then once the briefing was done, everyone kind of looked around the room and went, well, I guess that's not going to work too well. So let's go back to the drawing board and figure out, how we can achieve an objective in national interests or in economic policy. I heard briefings about ideas for sanctions from very senior people, and then the economists at the table and the finance people at the table said, well, here's probably what will happen if you impose that kind of sanction, and here's what it could do to the global economy. And then the leaders kind of sat back and thought, okay, well, maybe that's not such a good idea after all. Let's find something else. So the advantage of democracy is that we have that information and we have that expertise. And while that can be frustrating and it can create some delay in effective policy implementation, it prevents really catastrophic mistakes. And so the concern is now, if it is the case, it's clearly the case that career professionals are being let go or fired or encouraged to early retirement in the hundreds of thousands, and that there is a hollowing out of that expertise in government. It is not always clear that that is politically motivated, but and in fact, often the political leadership says it is a cost-cutting measure, but the effects are the loss of expertise and knowledge that you need to make good decisions. And then layered on top of that, what you are seeing specifically, but not only in the case of our professional military, is you are seeing a climate of fear and intimidation that, again, is characteristic of countries like Russia, where you see time, and you saw it in Afghanistan in 1979, that the military was not driving the decision to invade Afghanistan. That was a Politburo decision that did not know what it was getting into. And it led to it contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union. So serious of a failure and a mistake was it. So as an American, it is deeply concerning to see the potential that our professional military will not be respected, allowed to remain apolitical, and allowed to give their best military advice to the commander-in-chief so that the commander-in-chief can make the best decisions. In the end, the president is the commander-in-chief. And if the military says this idea you have, this policy idea is going to be costly, has a low probability of success, and could cause, tens of thousands of more casualties. If the president says, and in history, the American president has said, I hear you, but that's what we're going to do, the military says, so far, yes, sir, not yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and then does its very best to execute the decision, even if it was something they advised against. And I don't want my military. I want to feel safe. I want to feel secure. I want to feel part of a national security establishment that respects our military and their service and their sacrifice. I don't want to face what Russians face every day, which is a military that cares more about how many stars they have on their sleeve than speaking the truth to power.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Back to you, Maria, and we've saved a little bit more than 20 minutes for questioners, and I'm sure we have a number of them on the chat function. Thank you again, Celeste.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Celeste. Yes, we do have a couple of questions already, and please, for the rest of you in the audience, please keep typing them in. So there's a question here from Christian Fisher. We're seeing an erosion in common transatlantic values. The Hague Summit Declaration did not even mention them. What is the best policy advice to Europeans in order to engage in a proactive approach towards the broader US decision makers, apart from delivering on the 5.5 and 1.5% targets very quickly? So let's start with that one.
Sure. And just, it's a great question. I think my answer may not be one that everyone or many support. I think the Hague Summit was important for not showing a fracturing of NATO unity, and prioritizing that was the right call. Pressing difficult issues, there's a moment for the alliance to grapple with very difficult issues and to have very robust discussions about issues on which the different allies may have fundamentally different positions. This was not the moment. With the war continuing to go on in Ukraine, with the Kremlin looking for ways to crumble the alliance and create fissures and disunity within the alliance, the prioritization of unity over airing difficult issues was a clear strategic choice of the leadership, and one that I think was the right choice. What would be concerning is if that is what happens year after year after year, as, for example, we've faced with a failure to revisit the NATO strategic concept, which continues to identify Russia as a partner, not as an adversary. But for the time being, I think it was more important to be able to come out of the Hague Summit showing that alliance unity.
Thank you. Oh yes, the person who asked the question wanted to correct himself. 3.5, of course, not 5.5. But we have another question here. It's a bit specific, but specifically related to the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and the current position and role of the US in transatlantic defense. What do you think is the geostrategic position of the Azores archipelago in general, and the Lajes base and the ocean port of Praia de Vitoria as an anchor for underwater and surface surveillance and response positions in the future, with the increasing presence of the PRC and the BRICS Plus proxies in the Atlantic, including possible polar routes? So there you have it. Sounds very specific to me, but perhaps you are much more familiar with this than I am.
I'm not. Thank you. But thank you for the question, because it brings back to the article or the discussion we had surrounding the point I was trying to make, which is our access, basing, and overflight in Europe and in regions adjacent to Europe support American global national security interests, not only the NATO alliance. And with an increasingly active Chinese, ostensibly commercial shipping presence in Africa, ostensibly scientific presence in Antarctica and the Arctic and throughout the Pacific as well as the Atlantic Oceans, being able to count on cooperation with European allies and partners more broadly, with EU countries who may not be members of the NATO alliance, is very important, even for leaders of the Trump administration who are skeptical of the continuing importance of Europe and wanting to focus on either Western Hemisphere affairs or China specifically. The ability for the United States to operate in all of the world's oceans is not simply focused on American home ports, North American home ports, but on the kinds of resources and locations, some of which we have long-term basing agreements, some of which we have generous visitation and resupply agreements, but it is a network that enables the United States to cope with a variety of challenges. And so in the end, I'm simply agreeing with the premise of the question, and I think it was a really good one to highlight.
Thank you. We have a new question now from Ben Tetik. Do you consider friction as an opportunity for recalibration in decision making or a risk in making decision in terms of coherence? I presume this ties into the last thing you discussed about the NATO and the Hague Summit and all that.
Yeah, disagreements and friction is incredibly important for good decision making, as it's not just information, which I've already referred to, but you don't want to have a bunch of people who just sort of show up for a meeting and tell the president, yes, I agree, yes, I agree, yes, I agree, if they're papering over different assessments, different points, different ideas that need to be considered. So a healthy cabinet meeting depends upon a healthy National Security Council process in which all the expertise, but also the different takes, different views on options are fully aired, fully worked out, and in the end, the president makes the decision. There aren't a lot of, at least in my experience, National Security Council meetings where every single principal sitting at the table 100% agreed with every other principal at the table. But what they did do was they had the opportunity to lay out their views, talk about the evidence, work through it, answer questions from the president, and then in that process, enable the president to understand the implications of the decisions that needed to be made and make the best possible choice with the information and the assessments that you have. So not having disagreements is not necessarily a good sign of a political process. But having all of those disagreements aired in public or leaked in the press is a sign of a broken National Security Council process, because a State Department or a Department of Commerce or a Department of Treasury or Defense that is having its say in front of the president and is respected and airs it usually will do it there. And when they are not able to have that conversation in those appropriate venues and in those processes, that's when they try to start influencing the process through leaks and through complaints publicly.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions at the moment, so please, anyone in the audience who is still considering asking a question, you still have time to do so. I could ask a question myself while we wait for more questions from the audience. In your perspective, how do you think that it impacts Putin and the Kremlin when Trump keeps changing his style and message with regards to the war, with him seeming to side with one side more and then a few days later siding with the other side, and sometimes using very harsh language to talk about Russia and Putin personally? How do you think that it plays out in the Kremlin?
I think that kind of mixed message is less of a challenge for the Kremlin than it is for allies and partners.
Mm-hmm.
I think that allies and partners are investing in long-term relationships with the United States, but also in the specific instance in investing in Ukrainian capabilities. And while I believe that Europe is determined to support Ukraine regardless of the strength, direction, or form of U.S. support to Ukraine, being able to coordinate makes the most efficient use and effective use of resources. What I saw during my 3 years during the Ukraine war was an incredible partnership in which different countries took on different tasks and areas of focus, whether that was the Ukrainian Air Force, whether it was its tank force or artillery or air defense. And by coordinating and having that predictability, we were able to make those kinds of long-term procurement contracts that I think optimized on those resources. The Kremlin probably would like to have clarity in the direction that they prefer, which is the United States supporting Putin's terms for a peace settlement. But I think what we've seen is the Kremlin can manage unpredictability and changes of position because it is able to stay focused on its objectives and adjust tactically, because Putin is not subject to an independent media or citizens rising up and saying, we don't like how you're spending our money, or citizens saying, we don't like your military strategy because we've got over 1 million casualties. His tactics are not constrained or affected in that way as they are in democracies. So while I don't think it's a particular advantage necessarily, I don't think it is a great drag on the Kremlin's ability to conduct to move towards its objectives.
I see. Thank you. We have a few more questions now. Thanks, everybody. We have a question from Raluca Blair. Do you think that Moldova could have a similar fate to Ukraine in terms of, will the Kremlin push back again and more violently after this massive failure in the last Moldovan elections?
It is a great question, and I think the Kremlin will not give up to try to retain control over Transnistria through the residual military occupation in Transnistria. And the Kremlin will continue to try to influence Moldova through information operations, through certain corrupt business relationships, and try to affect elections. But in military terms, as long as Ukraine is sovereign and independent, Russia doesn't have many options for direct intervention. Ukraine is geopolitically, between a huge country, between Russian military forces and Moldova. Even if you could imagine sort of Russian naval infantry forces that, in theory, I suppose, could try to move up the Danube tributary and invade Moldova, it wouldn't be a sufficient force, and it's hard to imagine. So I think the threat to Moldovan sovereignty and independence remains mostly in those buckets, the unresolved conflict, and Europe should, really think seriously about whether unresolved conflicts need to continue to be such a constraint on the ability of these countries to advance towards EU relationships, and the attempt to influence politically and through corrupt business practices.
Thank you. Now the questions are really starting to roll in. That's great. We have a question from Mona Okwosa. She's asking, in your 4 decades of experience and expertise representing the US in your roles, do you feel comfortable that the US legacy in international conflict solving will continue despite all current domestic developments?
I am concerned that, back to kind of a bit of the theme of the article that Leo referred to, that the role of the United States in conflict resolution has often been, when it has been positive, when it has been successful, it's because our stature, our long-term relationships, our long-term commitment to partnership and things like foreign investment and foreign trade creates benefits in that relationship for other countries that sometimes leads them to compromise and move towards that space that is needed in every negotiation in the middle, where interests and positions can be aligned. As the United States is a less consistent partner and less committed to long-term relationships and stable principles of international law and reliability, it does suggest that the ability of the United States to come in and persuade the parties will be more complicated. And that kind of trust and reliability is not something you build overnight. And so there could well be a lasting effect of some of the questions that many countries have now about American reliability and that long-term partnership.
Thank you. We have a question from Markus Mölöniemi, who is saying thank you for your excellent remarks and pointing out that senior fellow for the IISS, Nigel Gold-Davies, remarked that the Ukraine war has entered a new phase due to policy changes by America, Europe, and China, and domestic economic strains, which are reshaping Russia's calculus. With this in mind, what do you think will the Kremlin do to test the Western allies' resolve to continue supporting Ukraine?
Well, we've already seen one dimension of testing resolve, which is the drone overflights and intrusions, not just in Poland, but further west. I think that when the United States was in the lead on security assistance, what we clearly observed was that the Kremlin did not dare to conduct those kinds of operations, that it was taking action to avoid any chance of escalation with NATO. Putin was very risk averse. But now what we've seen in the last couple of months is a Russian military that seems to have been given the okay to adopt more risk acceptant operations, even if they could elicit responses or actions by NATO allies. And so I think that is a larger context that we're now going to live with as the war in Ukraine continues. It seems to have diminished for the moment, but I think we're going to see more of this kind of testing and other dimensions of testing in other domains, whether that is electronic warfare interference, potentially satellite interference, potentially cyber activities, potentially additional sabotage against critical infrastructure. I think that is, we're just in we're in that different era of the conflict. I know I've seen some reports that the Russian economy is, challenged. I think that's true. But again, what we've seen time and time again is that the Kremlin is able to mitigate and manage some of those challenges. And in the absence of a truly strategic approach to cutting resources to the Russian economy and to the Russian budget, I think the Kremlin will find a way, at least for several more years, to mitigate those challenges. So I see perhaps some tactical changes, but not a fundamental undermining of Putin's determination to continue the war.
Thank you so much. I think that is all the questions we have time for. So I'll hand the floor back to Leo. Thank you.
Once again, Celeste, thank you so much for your time, for your very clear and really some terrific insights across the board. There would have been so much more to discuss, but we are limited to the 1 hour. And on behalf of FIA, on behalf of also the wider audience outside of Finland that watches these webinars and many that will watch it through YouTube and LinkedIn channels and so forth, this has really been a great service. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again before too long, I hope.
Thanks so much, Leo. It was really wonderful to talk with you. Thank you.